Thanks, Lynn, for that humbling introduction. You know, one thing that's weird when you've been around as long as me is you realize you've been around for a while. And so I think this might be one of the first talks I've ever given at the department level in my 31 years here. And I think I have been in rank here at the university longer than anybody else in the department. But for those of you who wind up sticking around 30 years, you'll still feel like a new kid, which is weird. And, you know, and we're going to be talking a little bit later about self-perceived maturity and whatever factors are involved in making you feel mature as a scholar or as an academic. I'm still learning. So the title of my talk today is there an addictive personality or an alcoholic personality? It's a little bit of a bait and switch, as you'll see, because I'll disabuse you of that notion, hopefully pretty quickly, but talk about the myriad ways that personality is related to alcohol use, alcohol use disorders, alcohol dependence, the various ways that both people drink and that they get into trouble with alcohol. I'd like to start out with the acknowledgments because last time I tried to acknowledge people, I spaced it. And so I thought, okay, I'm going to just give, and this is really just a smattering of many of people who've worked with me on the work that I'll be talking about today over the years. So these are the folks who are currently in the lab and have been in the lab fairly recently. I don't mean to give short shrift to many others who I'll also be mentioning. And also to the very generous support of, from NIH, that a lot of the data I'm going to be talking about today costs a lot of money to collect. If anybody here has been involved in longitudinal research, particularly on relatively large samples, you realize that even if the measures you're collecting from them are not very expensive on a kind of per capita basis, when you put all that time and energy together and the personnel needed to follow along a cohort over a very long period of time, the bills add up. And so in addition to supporting me, there's a training grant that supported a number of students who've worked with me, as well as a number of other people in the department. And I'm going to start out talking about my college girlfriend, who I'm going to call Madam X. This is actually a relatively recent picture, and if those want to know who this is in the White Mountains near where the bristlecone pines are, the oldest living things in the world. And so we're still good friends, we are still hiking. And the reason I bring her up is if I think of the concept of addictive personality, she's the first person I think of. But we were surprised. This is after college. There are a bunch of us living in San Francisco. And she announced one day that she was going to quit smoking cigarettes. And all of us were absolutely stunned. You know, we thought, like, no way. There's no way that X is going to be able to quit. You know, she personified an addictive personality. Somebody, every single, you know, draft on a cigarette was sheer delight watching her. You know, she just took such pleasure in everything she did. And we assumed she wouldn't, but she did. One of the fascinating things that happened because of this, and people are interested in treatment and social networks, is there was this universal thought that spread through her social network was, if X could quit, any of us could quit. And in fact, because we thought she was so bad, it was this downward social comparison, because she is so bad off that if she could do it, we could do it. And miraculously, there was this mass attempt at quitting. Just because X decided she was going to quit and seemed to have some initial success. But even though we all tried, none of us made it, except she did. But and if those of you are here February 16th for Terry Robinson's talk, and he talked about sign trackers, one thing I find fascinating about X's long-term recovery from tobacco dependence is if you're in a room with her and somebody lights up a cigarette, or starts to, she'll ask, can I light that for you? And she will take great delight in the handling the cigarette, having the smoke, and then immediately pass it back before she would inhale. And so we have this lay notion, and as I have here, there's lots of popular books on this topic of addictive personality, but I think it's safe to say that despite the fact that it's a very popular notion, there is absolutely no compelling evidence for like a unique configuration of traits that makes somebody an addict. We'll talk about traits that are correlated with becoming addicted or having problems with drinking or just excessive use. But that's not to say it's an addictive personality in the way that it's used clinically or in the lay literature. And today we'll be talking about what these traits are. We're not going to talk about many of them. There are just a couple of big broadband traits that I think we could talk about. But I think the more interesting one is how might they actually be related to alcohol dependence or addiction. I don't want to say, when I say there is no addictive personality, it's not to say there aren't a lot of individual differences we know that are important. And in fact, in this slide here, some of these traits like impulsivity, anxiety, depression, things related to negative affectivity or poor self-regulation are among the big candidates that we look at and we know have a very strong track record. Genes, and as you'll see, we'll talk a little bit, seem to be related to these personality traits. We'll talk about age, because there's probably no variable that's more strongly correlated with the likelihood of somebody meeting criteria for an alcohol use disorder than chronological age. But it's not to say that there's this really unique, specific thing we could go target on its own in isolation of everything else. So we've known for a long time that personality has something to do with it. But as I said before, we want to really focus on the how and the why, because it turns out there's probably a number of different ways that personality is related to both alcohol use and the problems that alcohol use lays on people and gets them into trouble in one way or another, either because of misbehavior or because of the alcohol dependence syndrome, where they need alcohol and their body adapts to it and they become preoccupied with it and use it compulsively. I'm going to highlight three major, I would call it themes or meta-themes as opposed to a very detailed mechanism. One is that personality in part determines how people respond to alcohol. And you'll see that this line of research goes back very far. We'll also describe some work that we've been active with, and actually probably Lynn Cooper, who just introduced me, is most associated with. Personality is related to the reasons why people will tell you they drink, at least, and that probably has a biological underpinnings there. And then something we've been interested in our lab recently, personality relates to niche seeking and environment selection. And different environments are differentially associated with risk for drinking. Living on a college campus here, actually living was a slip, but not an inaccurate one. We have some amazing environments that are compelling for people to drink. And in fact, we'll talk about that a little bit and why it's actually interesting natural type experiment. And then we're going to finish up, even though hopefully you'll forget I mentioned this by the end of the talk because I want to surprise you with it. The concept is, are there drunken personalities? Something that Rachel Winograb in my lab has been studying is something that is kind of embedded within our kind of folk culture. There's different kinds of drunks, good drunks, bad drunks. And the question is, can we use personality theory and personality assessment approaches to actually assess this, assess it reliably, and then if so, does it have any clinical relevance or is it just kind of an interesting curiosity? So we're going to talk about individual differences in sensitivity to rewarding and disinhibiting effects. And I'm going to focus on rewarding because we don't have a lot of time, and that's where I've actually done most of my work. But we're going to start out with William McDougall. And for those of you who don't know who William McDougall was, he was probably the most influential English-speaking psychologist in the first half of the 20th century. He started his career in England, but then went to Harvard and was the first William James Professor of Psychology. He went to Duke, where he founded the psychology department there, and actually started under a student, J.B. Rhine, the so infamous parapsychology center that's there. If you go to Duke, you'll still see a statue. There's a statue of him there. And the thing I find fascinating about this quote from 83 years ago is thinking really hasn't changed that much in 83 years. So McDougall says, I have observed, first of all, that's a great line. We have to do, if you read our method sections that drag on for pages and pages and pages, there's a lot of hard, spade work that goes into doing our work. He's able to write a paper, basically, I have observed, so things have changed in some ways in 83 years. But if you actually look at the theory underlying his observation, that really hasn't changed very much. So he's arguing that the extroverted personality is very susceptible because basically they have very little cortex to control their limbic centers. And so basically, it doesn't take much, if alcohol really is differentially hitting higher cortical centers, it doesn't take much to wipe it out. And it sounds maybe a little bit quaint, but if you look at theories of how alcohol disinhibits people, that's basically what the theory is today. Only now we talk about executive function and frontal lobes and the actual molecular mechanisms of how alcohol affects dopamine and affects GABA and affects glutamate has all evolved. The basic concept hasn't changed. So I find that absolutely fascinating when I go back. If we look at more clinically focused people, Hervey Cleckley, who many of you know as kind of the father of the concept of psychopathy. Film buffs might know him as the co-writer of Three Faces of Eve, along with Thigpen. But he came up with these criteria for defining what a psychopath is, which are still very influential, both in psychology and in forensics. But one of his defining features is fantastic and uninviting behavior after drink. That there's a kind of person who, when they have a drink or two, is likely to be pretty obnoxious and difficult in one way or another. Now, he does say parenthetically in that statement, too, and sometimes without, which also is an interesting thing, is these guys who are really obnoxious when they're drunk, they could also be pretty obnoxious when they're not drunk. And if we had a longer period of time, we could talk about the concept of pathological intoxication, which has kind of moved in and out of the mainstream over the years. But one of the reasons why this concept of pathological intoxication was thrown out of DSM-4 was because when they could find these case reports of people who would drink a lot and they'd be really obnoxious, they'd find out they were often that way a little bit without it. And so it wasn't like there was this very allergy to alcohol that brought out all these strange behaviors. So I'm going to basically talk about, for a minute, my dissertation. And so one thing that's important to remember for all of you guys who are working on your dissertations, you can carry this baggage around for a long time. And so I think it's helpful. I had heard you could, do a good job on your dissertation. You'll be carrying it around for like 3 or 4 years, giving job talks, and and that's what people will know you for. But if you wind up staying in the same area, it could be a hell of a lot longer than that. And this is a study I did with Bob Levinson, and which actually, as a bunch of graduate students, we were just curious about what the effects of alcohol would be on numerous indices of emotional response. And so basically, we brought people into the lab. We gave them either a placebo or a fairly high dose of alcohol, one likely to get them up above legal intoxication, which at the time was higher than it is now. So these would be doses likely to get these men up to 0.1%. And then what we do is basically scare the bejesus out of them. And we do that in one of 2 different ways. We would tell them they had to tell this attractive woman who is sitting there what they liked and didn't like about their body and physical appearance, or that they were going to get an electric shock. And in both times we use what's called a pseudo-conditioning paradigm, where there's a countdown to it, and then you're on. And either you get a shock or you give a talk. And one of the things we found was that the alcohol really blunted, and we called it stress response dampening, physiological response, at least in the cardiovascular system. I'm not going to go into all the details, but then we kind of did a lot of data snooping. We said, okay, we collected these personality measures. Is there anything in there that seems to predict individual differences in the amount of stress response dampening you got from alcohol? And so that was experiment 1 we did. And we found that the scale called the McAndrew scale, and is this working here? It's not very, okay. Anyway, if you were high on this measure, which is associated, I'm not going to go into details of what it is, but it's kind of an agglomeration of a number of traits related to disinhibition and poor self-control. You see a big effect here. That is, the people who get alcohol show much less of a response. But if you were low on this scale, then you didn't really show much of an effect. So we say, okay, but this is data snooping. Let's go back in and let's see if we could do this in a new study where we kind of come up with refining that construct a little bit. And we did. We used both the McAndrew and the socialization scale of the CPI. And we were able to replicate that effect fairly well, suggesting that there's a certain kind of person who, and again, this is not how much they were stressed when sober. This is the interaction of alcohol and this trait reducing it. And I'm not going to talk more on this emotional response, but I do want to say that people have looked at other kinds of behaviors this way. Mainly Peter Giancola has looked at traits related to hostility, empathy, as well as executive control, and finds similar kinds of interactions, that it's the potent combination of alcohol and certain traits where we see some extreme of behavior. So I'm going to move on a little bit and say, well, what's the relationship between personality more generally and drinking or drinking-related problems or dependence? And there are, I don't know what the actual count is, but I don't think it would be hyperbolic to say thousands of studies where people have looked at some aspect of drinking, some personality trait, and then looked at a correlation cross-sectionally. And those data only get us so far, but by and large, they tend to show traits related both to poor self-regulation or disinhibition, and traits related to negative affectivity, negative emotionality, neuroticism. Both of those are related, even though the traits related to disinhibition tend to correlate more strongly. The problem with these kinds of studies, and this has been known for a very long time, is it doesn't distinguish pre-alcoholic characteristics, that is, what somebody was like before they developed a drinking problem. From those, we consider the clinical alcoholic. And in fact, a lot of the initial studies were alcoholics in treatments in VA facilities or various kinds of residential treatments. And we found fairly early on, when you'd retest those people after they'd been sober, their personality profiles, and this is like mainly MMPI work that was done in the 50s and 60s, look very different. So the prospective data here are really critical, particularly if you're looking at more severe kinds of outcomes. And so if we look prospectively, we find disinhibition traits definitely tend to predict prospectively. And we could, if we had more time, really look more at the facet level of exactly what we're talking about. But I'm kind of going to be flying at a higher altitude today. But to some extent, too, neuroticism and traits related to negative affectivity are also related. Sometimes, and I'll talk about this will creep up a little bit later in the talk, we have effects associated with positive emotionality or extroversion as well. But those tend to be very life stage and situationally specific. The other piece, and there's a picture of my colleague Wendy Slutsky here, is that a lot of the things that people have been interested in for a very long time, the genetics of alcohol, actually looks like it's correlated with the genetics of personality. And this had been postulated back 15 years earlier than I think Wendy's classic study, but had not really been demonstrated until she put together the data on a population-based sample that I think was fairly convincing and actually building upon some earlier work with looking at conduct disorder and antisociality more generally. Is that an accurate statement, Wendy? Is there anybody between you and Cloninger? So this was really a landmark study that Wendy performed. And so when we're talking about the genetics of alcoholism, and this is still true, even though there might be things related to the tendency to develop dependence on a substance, much of the genetics of alcoholism is the genetics of broad externalizing behavior. There probably are some unique things that might be related to addiction, and there might even be further related to alcohol, but most of the genetics of addiction that people have been talking about is really related to the genetics of individual differences in normal personality traits, or at least that's my interpretation of the literature. And so this is just a slide from that study of Wendy's. And I think this is just to make this point a little bit larger, even though I've been focusing on alcohol. This issue of high neuroticism, low conscientiousness pops up in virtually anything we might study. And so, in a sense, one of the things we could give a talk on, is there a bad personality? Maybe that's another talk I'll ask Tim to give sometime. But there are these configurations of traits that pop up all the time and in various kinds of conditions. And this is a study that was done here, one of my samples with Tim Truel and I. And what you'll see, if you look across, and again, this is neuroticism, extroversion, openness, agreeable conscientiousness, across various kinds of disorders that you could study, you'll find there's like a bad profile. The bad profile is high neuroticism and low extroversion, agreeableness, and conscientiousness. And there's a little bit of nuance or filigree as you go across the different disorders and how high or low the E might be and where O plays on. And there may be in different measurement approaches slight differences, but this is a very robust finding. And it's actually the point now, I think it could almost be a law of personality and psychopathology, is you have this configuration of traits, you're going to look bad in psychopathological dimensions. So a lot of people are interested in this question. Okay, so we have this relationship, and again, the question is why? And it's why people interested in alcohol are interested in it. There was a Psych Bull review recently in this topic that's saying we found it, and we need to really start going after what the actual mechanisms might be. So first, we already just showed earlier, at least illustratively, able to demonstrate that individual differences in personality could shape affective responses to alcohol. But if that's the case, should it affect how people think? Can we only see it when we study somebody in the lab? Or do people walk around with this when they're not intoxicated? And could that somehow affect whether or not somebody is likely to drink? So I'm going to talk now about a study we started in 1987, which I assume is probably before most of the people in this room were born. Just to say, when you do longitudinal work, you really take on a different perspective on people's lives and how they change over time and what the time courses of different processes may be. So we started out, half the people were at high risk for alcohol dependence, half were at low risk by virtue of having a paternal father who has alcohol dependence, a biological father. Here we're going to talk about data over the first 17 years, at least today I will, but at first I'm going to focus a little bit on what we found in the first year. And this is just a brief slide describing how we select people into these samples, and then when you follow people over a long period of time, you'll see that people move in and out of the sample. We had very good retention in this particular sample. But also when people die, those people don't move back in. But other people, unless they say, we're absolutely not, we don't want you to darken our door ever again, we go back to people. So we would have two different levels of refusal, permanent refusers and temporary refusers. So unless somebody tells us they're a permanent refuser, we come knocking again. And so here's one of the first, actually probably path analyses I ever did. This was done back in probably 1989 or so. And one of the things we were looking at, based on this emerging model of how family history might be related to alcohol dependence, there was at the time some indication in the literature that alcohol liability was associated with verbal ability. Then we also looked at these two, kind of from a big two perspective, this more behavioral under control or disinhibition and neuroticism, and said how might that affect what people think about alcohol if they actually respond to alcohol in different ways. And then ultimately, how does that relate to alcohol involvement, which we conceptualize as very broadly, both use and heavy use and various kinds of problems that people might have. And one of the things that we found, and I believe this is the first time this was observed, and was that actually personality was related to expectancies. And we had a fairly crude measure of expectancies. These were all outcome expectancies, beliefs that people hold about if they drink, how alcohol is likely to affect them. And basically, this is kind of a global measure of if I drink, good things happen. And it could be good things happen, I have a good time, I'm sexier, parties are more fun. So it was, there are very specific facets of expectancies, but these big super factors emerge. And I think this is a pretty good measure of one. The other thing is, I think it's important to distinguish, just because somebody has an idea of how alcohol might affect them, that doesn't mean that's why they're going to drink. It might be a necessary condition for why they'll hold a specific motive or reason for drinking. So you could think that alcohol will make me very something, but not drink for that reason. So we were also interested in looking at the reasons why people give. And we have some data from motives. Actually, we started out before this measure was available, or a measure based on this model from our colleague Lynn Cooper, who really focused on these internally focused motives, enhancement and coping. But to try and see, okay, where do these fit into this larger picture? And she had actually in some of her earlier work had pointed out the importance of personality. We started looking at this when we had 17 years of data. And we were also curious whether or not motives related differentially to why people were drinking, or the reasons people gave for why they were drinking during late adolescence and emerging adulthood versus when they were more solidly into early and mid-adulthood. So we modeled that as kind of two separate correlated traits. And when we look at this, we could see, very similar to the work that Lynn had done, is that traits more related to disinhibition were related to enhancement motives, basically motivation to get high, for pure reward seeking. And it seemed to be related to AUDs during emerging adulthood. I don't have, this is a just identified model, so the crosspaths are in there. They're actually in this model not significant. So it's not as if we're cherry picking these particular paths. And then we also see something very similar going on, that people who report more negative affectivity were more likely to report coping motives. And interestingly, though, we found even though AUDs during emerging adulthood and in early mid-adulthood were highly correlated, the correlates look to be somewhat different, or at least with respect to these motives. So I'm going to bring up this age issue because, as I mentioned earlier, it's probably one of the most important correlates. And if we want to understand alcohol use disorders, we have to understand the age prevalence curve. So I call it a curiously strong age gradient because I find it actually more curious than Altoids. And one of the things that I find extremely curious is this drop between 18 to 25 and 26 to 30 and the prevalence of past year alcohol dependence. Alcohol dependence is considered to be the more severe variant of alcohol use disorder, what we used to call alcoholism. I don't want you to imply that the average person who meets criteria, particularly early in life, fits your prototype of a chronic alcoholic. But it does mean that they're having relatively severe, if not problems, involvement with alcohol. And one of the things you see is this dramatic drop that occurs during this period of time. And if you walk out of here not remembering anything else, you would say, boy, this alcohol use or alcohol dependence is really a disorder of early adulthood and late adolescence. It's really an extraordinary epidemiologic fact. So we'd say, well, okay, well, that's interesting. Could we explain that? What's that about? And if that is that related to personality, which we'll get to in a minute, or is it related just to the social context of young adulthood and late adolescence? The big decrease, and people have been talking about this for a very long time, is so-called maturing out. That is, people leave the party zone of the university, they get jobs, as is, they go to university, they get jobs, they get married, they become parents, and the idea is that the act of being in these roles prevents them from partying as much as they would like. It's not like they don't want to party from this perspective. It's just they just don't have the time. And there's a lot of data from this. In this slide I'm going to show you, these are people who are single at 2 points in time from the Monitoring the Future panel study. These are people who are married at 2 points in time. So this is a study that followed people up over 20 years. And so the people who are married tend to drink less than the people who are single. And the people who are divorced at 2 points in time, they kind of look like the single people. But interestingly, again, these are prospective data. The people who were single and get married go down. And the people, I think very interesting, the reversal of people who were married and then get divorced, they go up. So it does suggest that this is not a long-term trait-like thing. There's something very situational that you see, and that's true for men, We could look at the exact same phenomenon for women. And if we look at women who become pregnant, you'll see that their drinking drops almost to nothing. And actually, I don't have the slide for men, but Mind in the Future looks at the spouses of these women and sees something similar. They don't go down to 0. They go from like 30 to 15. So they show some sympathy, but not complete sympathy with their pregnant spouse. And I'm going to talk a little bit about Zia McCabe of the Dandy Warhols, because I've not been able to find any other self-description of what maturing out is about as much as Zia. And Zia was pretty wild. She was known for performing naked. And if anybody has seen the movie Dig, they may have seen clips of her when they would be performing. But then she becomes the model of domesticity. And so if you want to know what the hell happened to Zia, we're fortunate enough to actually have an interview from the classic Rock and Roll Mamas. So let's, is the volume set for this? Okay. This is from the full-length documentary.
Yeah, I mean, they definitely are because, I was doing this relationship community and it was all about getting the party started, moving everybody from one party to the next, and that's definitely, a comment that Courtney had made and someone was kind of reminiscing about that being my role, and he said this time, oh, that's how I used to be things.
Well, okay, Rachel, do you want to say the rest of what she was going to say? We'll give it one more shot, and if not, I'm going to give the summary so we don't just keep getting caught up in this Groundhog's Day thing.
Yeah, I mean, they definitely are because, I was doing this relationship community and it was all about getting the party started, moving everybody from one party to the next, and that's definitely, a comment that Courtney had made when someone was kind of reminiscing about that being my role, and he said this kind of, oh, that's how I used to be thing, and, I mean, it definitely proved otherwise, like, it's not really how it used to be, it's just not what I do as a full-time lifestyle. It's definitely something that feels.
Okay, unfortunate. We're gonna go ahead, but she does describe for her. She does describe how she becomes, after pregnancy, like this perfect vessel. I'm going to do you should do this, Rachel, not me. So I'm not going to be Zia McCabe right here, but describes for you how all of a sudden there is this whole part of her that is totally incompatible with being a partier when she is a mother. But she still has these yearnings to go out and party. And sometimes when the Happy Mondays are in town, I don't remember who all these groups she refers to, she'll want to go out and party and play. But then she goes and she realizes, this is stupid. Why am I just pushing myself to do all this? I have to get on the plane tomorrow. So anyway, this is on YouTube. You could go hear what Zia has to say. But she does speak of it very eloquently. But the question we had is that all there is? Is it just maturing out that it helps explain that epidemiologic age gradient in 12 months? And one of the questions is, well, maybe it's not just your environmental situation, these constraints on drinking that are changing, but maybe there's something changing inside as well. And so this is a figure from Brent Roberts' meta-analysis of personality change over the life course. And one of the things that's really very dramatic, if we look at these two big traits that are closest to the ones that I've been talking about today, traits related to self-regulation, traits related to neuroticism, we see a huge change over the life course, like a standard deviation change. And this period of time, this emerging adulthood, is the period of time where we see some of the steepest change occurring. So we were curious as to, well, are some of these changes that are occurring in personality possibly related to changes that we're seeing in alcohol use disorder prevalence? it's basically saying, okay, this thing is changing now, this other thing is changing now. We know they're related to each other cross-sectionally. We know they predict prospectively, but is changes in one related to changes in the other? And so what we did is we looked at our measures within our own data set. And here's a measure of impulsivity we came up. We see a big drop over time, similar to neuroticism. It starts flattening out a little bit, again, consistent with the larger literature on personality development. And here's our measure of alcohol problems, again, showing something relatively similar. And so this gets a little bit complicated. We've taken out most of our really ugly slides, but we still have some. And so basically, this is just a correlated growth process. And we have personality intercept, that's time 1, alcohol involvement at time 1. We have rate of change of personality, rate of change of alcohol involvement. And we're basically interested in whether or not there is a correlation here between. We know that from tons of study there's a correlation here. But we want to know if there's a correlation here. And unfortunately, there hadn't been much data at all to guide us on this question. The other thing is we know that marriage and parenthood, we glom them together here too, because in this college-educated, predominantly white sample, they're so highly correlated we can't really pull them apart. And then say too, and that's after, over and above, we controlling for marriage and parenthood. And so what happens when we look at impulsivity, we actually see that even though there is this effect on alcohol involvement, what we do see is a correlation that's almost as big as the baseline correlation. And just to illustrate what this looks like less abstractly, we took people whose intercept, that is kind of in the middle range at baseline of impulsivity, and then we just broke them up on their slope here. We could do this actually at every level, but this is just for illustrative purposes. And you'll see that the people who had the biggest decrease in impulsivity also had the biggest decrease in their drinking. So this is just kind of more of a simple way of portraying these more abstract path diagrams. And we see a similar thing going on for neuroticism as well. And then we replicated this on a more traditional 5-factor model. We did not collect 5-factor data until people were 21 years old. And so this work that was done by Andrew Littlefield really shows that this is a very robust finding that is not only true in one set of personality measures, generalizes to other alternative personality measurement approaches. I think it's important here too. We did a lot of technical twiddling with the types of models to rule out other kinds of potential problems. And no matter what we did, we find this effect. And it's above and beyond role incompatibility effects. Now another piece, if we go back to the work I had mentioned earlier that Lynn Cooper has done, we can say, okay, so if we think of personality as being related to drinking through motives, what happens when we study this process prospectively? So in other words, the changes in personality relate to changes in drinking motivation, which in turn relate to changes in drinking. And can these effects we have be explained, at least statistically, in part on the basis of motivation? And these models really get ugly, but I'm going to try and make them as pretty as I can. First, if we look at motive change, with coping, we see it goes down during much of the 20s, but then kind of levels off and pops up a little bit, which was interesting. We weren't expecting that. With the enhancement, the kind of like getting high, that one kind of showed more of a straight age gradient, or at least more of a linear age gradient. And so this is your typical mediational model that many of you know of and have read about, where basically you want to see if you have this intervening variable of your mediator, can it statistically explain your relationship between your exogenous variable, in this case personality, and your ultimately endogenous variable, in this case drinking. And we kind of switch it a little bit so that now we're doing it in terms of change. And these are models that have been worked out by Dave McKinnon. And it gets a little bit more complicated than this, because we really want to be able to look at to what extent, say, baseline personality affects change in these other things. You really want to saturate your model to rule out a lot of potential alternative explanations so that what is unique, you feel confident is not due to a model misspecification. And so we play around with different kinds of models. But the bottom line effect here is that when we look at the effect from, say, neuroticism to alcohol problem slope, that is change in neuroticism to change in alcohol problems, which was a moderate size before, we explain it with drinking motives here, the coping, and we do that with impulsivity as well. So the bottom line from these analyses, as individuals become both less impulsive and less neurotic, they're less likely to use alcohol to cope, and that explains some of it. Our measurements for these are not ideal. One of the things that you discover when you do longitudinal studies is what you have at baseline might not be the measurement that you would prefer to have today, and many of the measurements you do have are somewhat anachronistic and are certainly not ones you would pick today. But nevertheless, we were able to do quite a bit with what we had, and we felt that this is a really important kind of generalization of understanding what this whole maturing out piece is likely to be. Just a brief note, Rachel Winograd recently showed, we were curious, we actually asked people how mature they felt for their age as part of this, but not tied to alcohol per se. And we find that when people are 25, no matter how alcohol involved they were, it didn't seem to be related to whether or not they saw themselves as mature for their age. But you started seeing, as they were older, 29, 34, the ones who partied saw themselves as less immature. They had some sense that they weren't being where they should be developmentally, which we think might be useful from a clinical perspective if you're trying to engage people in treatment and trying to motivate change. So it's not so maturing out's not solely role incompatibility. It seems to be related to both normative personality changes and individual differences in it, and related to the various motives. And in fact, it's even related to whether or not someone sees themselves as a mature person for that age. In the last bit, we're going to talk about two additional areas that we found very interesting. And that is, one of the things we know about personality is people seek out environments that are compatible with their temperament. And if that's the case, maybe that has something to do with drinking, because we know there are very, very powerful effects of the environment on drinking. And so we thought if we could look at what factors might be related to environment selection, particularly environments that are particularly associated with heavy drinking, we might be able to understand yet another way that personality might work. We also thought there may be different forms of personality-environment covariation, and I'll explain what that means in a second. So first of all, as I was alluding to earlier, we have some really powerful environments for studying drinking on this campus. And it's not just on our campus. In every national study done, any campus with a big Greek system, that tends to be the center of drinking life for that campus. And as you'll see here, and we're not unusual this way at Missouri, the people who are in the Greek system drink a lot more. And they have a lot more problems too. And one of the things that you'll see is not just that people party a lot, but there's often very serious consequences associated with this really extreme kinds of partying. And if you just go and Google, you could find many cases every year of alcohol-related poisonings or alcohol-related injuries or hazing-related fatal injuries, all involving alcohol. So it's not just the party issue and how that relates to risk, but there's a lot of potential acute harm associated with some of these environments. In fact, one of the things, I shouldn't say, I actually exercise some self-regulation, which I rarely do, in terms of some slides, because if you actually look at pictures of hazings, which you could find online, it's absolutely extraordinary that the humiliation that people will subject themselves to in the interest of actually attaining some kind of status in a Greek organization. So I'm now going to talk about another study that started in 2002, where I think everybody was born by then in the room, and where we tried to basically screen all incoming freshmen and follow them for at least the 4 traditional years of college. And this, again, just shows patterns of non-response and people coming back in. We didn't have as good retention here, and I think it's a web-based study, because we don't develop the same kind of personal relationships we have when we're doing face-to-face interviews. And in the others, the 87 cohort, we did neuropsychological testing on multiple occasions. And so it was, in a sense, more intimate. Here, we're basically just getting, click this link and fill this out, and you'll get a $25 gift certificate or some payment, or we would usually vary it over time. And this is not that easy to see, but this is just, you'll see, this is a measure of heavy drinking. And we see over the first 3 years of school, and we focused here on the first 3 years when most of the people, or a lot of them, were still underage, where we see a lot of differences related to alcohol availability and drinking context. And so, one of the things we first did was look at, well, first of all, we know, and I'll show you, people select in, heavier drinkers select into the Greek system. So first of all, we wanted to know how much of an effect there could be. And we looked at that in 2 ways. This is the first way. Even though most people are either constant non-Greeks or constant Greeks, we did a longitudinal latent class analysis to say, are there people who changed their Greek status? And we did find smaller groups, I think these were like in the 50s and in the 80s, of people who changed their status. In other words, they started out Greek and then weren't Greek, and then other people who affiliated later. They're definitely unusual, but they're still useful in that they could tell us something about temporal covariation because it's using subjects as their own controls. And when we do these are model-derived data. You do see that there's variation associated in drinking with these change in Greek status. But most of our analyses focus on the people who are either consistently Greek or consistently non-Greek, at least over the first 3 years. And there are a few things to point out in this slide that I think are interesting. If we want to know how much somebody's drinking 5+ drinks, that is a binge, in their first semester, the best predictor is what they were drinking before they get to college. That's a big correlation, 0.68. But the other piece I think that's very interesting is this selection effect into the Greek system, that we see a fairly good-sized correlation between whether or not somebody is Greek and how much they were drinking before they got to college. There is then an additional effect, value added, if that's what you want to call it, on how much somebody is drinking during their first year, their first semester of college, as well as how much it tends to increase over time. So it's saying, okay, so we see here a lot of stability, at least in the rank order of drinking, but big selection into this high-risk environment, which then affects both short-term drinking patterns and long-term drinking patterns. Then we had personality data, and what happens when we kind of superimpose that into the model. And what we'll see, if we look at these selection paths, people are selecting in on the basis of their drinking, but look at the size of the extroversion path. People are selecting into the Greek system for other reasons. And something I find fascinating, there's a tiny correlation between extroversion and pre-college heavy drinking. So it looks like this selection into the environment might be for various kinds of social functions or other ways of getting these extroversion, sociability needs met that aren't at least initially coupled to alcohol. But it's a social trap. Once you're in there, then all of a sudden you're in this heavier drinking environment. And then we could look at to what extent we have this environment being selected kind of indirectly on traits related to more discontrol that is associated with pre-college heavy drinking versus other reasons why people might get into the same environment, but at least probably not initially motivated by drinking. So it looks like there's at least 2 ways of getting into the frat, but once you're there, you're still exposed to the same hazardous environment. So with respect to personality selections, we have individuals selecting in for traits both strongly related to alcohol seeking and traits that are incidental to drinking. But again, it's a social trap. Once you're there, you're there. It doesn't matter how you got there. Maybe it matters a bit, but you're still in this totally compelling environment. And I think if we really understand what these fit needs are, we might actually have a better way of planning housing or alternative kinds of activities so that these needs could be met perhaps without drinking per se. And I don't mean like this stuff, and I shouldn't really criticize some of the programming that's done on campus, but I'm not talking about like mocktail hours and some of these other alternatives to drinking that are almost like drinking, but other things that are exciting and fun and the things that people at this age really value, which is like, interacting with people of the opposite sex or same sex. It's basically being in environments that are highly motivating for that stage of life. I always have argued that we should keep the weight room at the gym open all night, because that's a place where people typically aren't drinking a lot, but they still go, they check each other out. It's a place to meet people. And so that might be a way of reducing alcohol-related harm, but still catering to some of the needs that this alcohol-rich environment promotes. So a couple of things. I've been talking about personality change leading to drinking. I don't mean to say we have solved this problem, and there's probably some bidirectional effects as well. We know from a lot of basic research, particularly with animal models, that heavy chronic consumption has affective consequences, and someone's hedonic set point changes. George Koob has talked about allostasis, and that's the notion, is your hedonic set point changes so that you're almost always like, 4 shots down, and you're just feeling crummy, and you need to drink to get back up. It's kind of like opponent process, but rather than constantly coming up to baseline, you're drifting lower. And so I think that's important. And we knew from, as I mentioned before, from those old clinical studies with the MMPI, that when people sober up, we see fairly big changes, particularly on traits related to negative affectivity. So I don't want to imply that this is all one way. So this is the first summary here. Personality relates to multiple pathways. There's at least 3 broad ways we could think of it, is sensitivity, motivation, and environment selection. And one of the things that I think is the most contentious, even though it seems like there's these 2 schools of thought. Personality is fixed and really doesn't change, and anything that seems like it's changing is artifact, versus personality really does change. I mean, we've known for a while that there's mean level differences, but the question is always, well, how important is the rank order change? And there is rank order change, and it's bigger the longer out you are between your baseline and your follow-up. But it's not to say, I don't want you to think personality is not relatively stable too, but that there's normative change, and there's really important individual differences in these normative changes that relate to a variety of different kinds of problem outcomes. And that I think that there's a lot of implications when we're trying to define what a given phenotype is for analysis. We might want to at least not necessarily base it on personality, but we need to think of it as a correlated feature of a genotype, because otherwise we might just we think we're studying one thing, but we're actually studying personality. So I think it's important to be able to disaggregate that. And also, if we're really interested in understanding alcohol effects and situational effects, the individual differences are huge. And that's not just true for alcohol, that's true for any psychoactive substance you could take. The nature of the environment is critical in how it interacts. Many, many years ago, I'm talking now like almost 40 years ago, I was a routine pilot subject for Rhys Jones, who was a marijuana researcher at the University of California, San Francisco. So whenever they would have like a site visit, I was working at UCSF at the time, they'd call me up because they didn't want to use a real subject, they knew me, and so I would be there, and they would actually give me placebo, but it was really amazing smelling placebo. And they would tell me stories. And Rhys Jones had done some LSD work, and this was at a period of time where a lot of LSD work had been done in the decade prior. And they talked about, it was known in the business that certain labs had big freak out rates, and other labs never had freakouts. And they were using the exact same dose, the exact same protocol. And it was obviously, it's hard to come up with any other conclusion. It was something about the interpersonal context of these labs and how poked and prodded and white-coated these various people are when people are tripping out of their minds, and how people are related to it. And that's just kind of an extreme example, but those things exist along a continuum, is how simpatico the environment is with the drug effect and individual differences in that. One of the things I think is important is if we want to track risk developmentally, perhaps we need to go under the hood a little bit and look at these more what I would say, deeper kind of characteristics than just say expectancies. One thing that analysts have argued for many years is you don't want to just deal with the symptoms, you want to look a little bit deeper and say, are you getting fundamental change in the motivational structures that are motivating it? And there's a large literature debate, in the behavioral literature, whether or not something like symptom substitution occurs, because originally the analysts would say, you could suppress this, but it's like whack-a-mole, symptom's going to pop up somewhere else. And there's a fair amount of still, I think that debate is still active. I think at first they thought the behaviorist won, and I think as people see now, chronicity of some kind of problems. There's perhaps a little bit less optimism of the ability of behaviorists to triumph overall. And so there may be ways of using some of these concepts to track relapse risk. So in other words, say you have somebody you've been able to suppress all their problems. Do you have differential relapse potential in people who've had concomitant personality change versus those people that you haven't? And then, as I was saying before, is maybe we want to keep the weight room open all night at the gym if we're actually thinking about how to design environments that might take people out of more risky things. So anyway, don't get up yet. This is the end, but not really the end. And I don't know if everybody recognizes Carrie, but I was actually going to use the film clip and thought that would be cruel. But I did want to talk about some of the work that Rachel Winograd has been doing now, which gets at this concept that I find fascinating, and that is the extent to which we have predictably reliable good drunks and bad drunks. And I'm just curious in this room, how many people think they know people who are like routinely bad drunks? Okay, how about people who are routinely good drunks? Yeah, so it's something we believe in. There's like nothing in the literature on this concept of a good drunk or a bad drunk. And the way the literature has been, it's been largely an experimental literature where they'll study risk-taking, aggression, but not really putting things together into an ensemble of indicators of what we would consider to be traits. So what we've done is saying, are there drunken personalities? And if so, can we assess them? And if so, is it relevant to anything? I think we'll say we know the first part, but we're not yet sure about the second. But the idea that there may be different kinds of affects and personality characteristics that are elicited has been around for a very long time. So here's Thomas Hobbes saying, the variety of drunken behaviors is the same as that of madmen, some of them being raging, others loving, others laughing, all extravagantly, but according to their several domineering passions. That there are these things that get routinely elicited. And this is just a summary of these different kinds of drunks that we could entertain. Happy drunks, angry drunks, sad drunks, wild and crazy drunks, flirty drunks. And so we said, okay, can we go out and actually assess these different types? But nobody ever came up with, maybe cartoonists have come up with their categories of drunks. So can we use a 5-factor model, just a robust, tried and true personality system for assessing drunken states? And so we went to the IPIP, Goldberg's International Personality Item Pool, and there was some cherry picking of items we thought might be related to intoxication, but still drawn from each of the 5 factors. And then we had people rate themselves first. Rate yourself when you're sober, rate yourself when you're drunk, basically. So these are the actual items. I don't want to spend too much time going through them, but you can see we came up with what we felt were good indicators for each of the 5-factor models. And if those people aren't familiar with the Goldberg model, he has intellect rather than openness to experience within his framework. And one of the things we find out is, and perhaps what you would expect, that these are just looking at the sober to drunk differences by sex. Actually, let me go back one slide. One of the things I wanted to highlight here is we got very comparable models of a drunken personality and a sober personality. In other words, these descriptors hung together similarly, whether or not we ask people to describe their drunk self or their sober self. And one of the things we see is we see the biggest differences in conscientiousness, so things like dependability and impulsivity, we see a big difference. Next biggest was agreeableness, and that is you would find people being less agreeable, surlier, which you might expect, or disagreeable. In the intellect, we did see slight increases in extroversion. And then for neuroticism, we saw very little, at least consistent. The other piece that we've done here is that's ongoing at this point, but almost done, maybe done today, is bringing people in with their drinking buddies. And so they come in and they rate themselves sober and drunk. They have their drinking buddy rate them sober and drunk, and then it's reversed to the other pair. And so one of the things that we were very pleased to find that the self-other agreement for rating sober traits is about the same by and large as it is for rating the drunken traits. So if you say, well, this is so situational and you wouldn't have any kind of good psychometric agreement, it's not huge. We're talking like 0.2, 0.3, 0.4, but that's what it is in the regular literature on normal personality. So we think we actually are able to go a little bit further with this, and I think ultimately, and this is just showing too that we see similar reports when people are reporting themselves and others. So it looks like there are fairly reliable differences. I'm not going to go into a lot of these speculations at this point, but to me the last part is perhaps the most intriguing to me, and that is if we think, at least for certain kinds of alcohol-related problems, there's a problem type, and that is the person who really kind of loses it when they drink, one way or another. Can we assess that efficiently? And whether or not that'll ultimately have utility, I don't know. But it's suggesting that it might be a way of coming up with yet another aspect of drunken comportment that we could actually use clinically, as opposed to just think of drunken comportment as a sociological construct that we could use to describe how people behave in general. So I think I'd like to end there, and thank you all for your attention. And Sarah. And I assume there's time for a question or two. Or yeah.
Is there the same huge spike in the 18+ years in alcohol dependence in European countries where it doesn't have the added forbidden more?
Actually, it's interesting. It's a good question. I think you're asking about the wrong location. The Europeans are terrible. I have not seen the binge drinking that we see in Europe now is probably worse than in the US. There is this, I would say, myth that used to be true, particularly in the Mediterranean countries, that they would see alcohol more as a foodstuff and less as an intoxicant. But what's been happening over the last 10 to 20 years is, Italy, Spain, Greece, these so-called Mediterranean countries where they have, again, much more of a drinking alcohol only with meals, it's kind of been co-opted by much more of a Northern European, UK pub culture. And so the binge drinking problems in Europe, by and large, are probably as bad as they are here. Eastern Europe, I think parts of it, you're absolutely right. And in fact, I'm a consultant on a study in Mauritius, and one of the fascinating things about Mauritius is we don't see this big, like peak hazard at age 19 and peak prevalence of problems at age 21. But we see much more this gradual change. So there are clearly important cultural pieces to it. And if you would, and there's biological pieces. Linda Spear was here, earlier and was talking about some of this biology of adolescence and how alcohol really probably facilitates a lot of the natural social reinforcement that adolescent rodents and humans experience, and that might contribute to why they're drinking a lot, coupled with that insensitivity she talked about. But in other cultures, that still might be true, but the nature of the constraints on the behavior and how it's used are still huge. So is there a universality to the age prevalence curve? The answer is no. But it is true, certainly that I'm aware of, for most Western cultures, but you could find cultures where you see a different epidemiology of drinking and problems. Yeah?
I have a question that is about the bait and switch that you informed us on right at the outset.
Uh-huh.
If you really want to understand whether there's an addictive personality, generally speaking, why the focus on alcohol when there's so many drugs that are so widely used, marijuana, meth,
Yeah.
heroin, all, and each of which have sort of a profile. Like coke head profile different than heroin junkie profile, meth head profile different than, very physiologically than cokehead, crackhead, I'm just wondering.
Well, I think I think it's a legitimate question. There's two things though. One is some of the lore about particular traits associated with different don't hold up. But on the other hand, and in fact, Paul Rosen a number of years ago, who really focuses more on kind of eating, but he was interested in just whether or not you have kind of a global factor of addictiveness across different substances. And basically, he kind of rejected it because you don't find a factor. I don't know if that's a legitimate test, because if you're always doing one thing, you might not have time to do something else, if you see what I'm saying. In other words, it's really hard to be addicted to everything. But if you actually, you'll see in the literature, like a true psychopath prefers, amphetamines because they're chronically under arrest. So you'll read about these speculations, but whenever we've done any, the last time we reviewed the literature to see could we find more specificity for some of this, it's been hard for us to find something very robust. I don't mean to discount it. These traits are very important and they are related to addiction. But whether or not it's this, popular notion, reward dependence is something that's been talked about quite a bit, as well as just poor self-regulation. If you think of the essential aspects of addiction is two pieces. One is being drawn to something in a very compelling way, and the other is having relatively poor ability to control. So kind of the restraint and the goad. Then all of a sudden, that gives us a framework for studying a variety of different traits, because we could find several different traits that are related to the attractiveness of the stimulus. And then we could find several different traits that are related to the ability to inhibit your approach to it. So those things are real, but whether or not there's really a different personality for one substance versus another, it may be, but I've not seen compelling data.
Okay, well, that aside, I'm just wondering if there's sort of a purely pragmatic factor of more funding being available for study of alcohol dependence than study of some of these illegal just one little.
Yeah, I would actually say there's probably more funding available for the others, but it's harder to study the others because it's just lower base rate. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I know a couple of social workers who were in Rockland, Maine, dealing with a very poor population, and there was some street drug that had hit their community, which was resulting in people going wacko, totally psychotic, self-mutilation, really, really wild stuff. And so I was like, so what is this? Does anybody know what it is? No, they have no idea. Are they going to study it? No, there's no money. So I just wondered.
Yeah, and again, when you see something like that, when you see a whole group of people using it, is that the kind of individual differences we're talking about? You'll see in marginalized indigenous populations, both in Canada and in Australia, people who will compulsively petrol sniff, which is the cheapest of all, because all you have to do is find a gas pump that's not being used and sniff. And, and I think sometimes when you're looking at a highly marginalized population, some of these individual differences that we're talking about within a general population might not be as salient. So I don't mean to dismiss the possibility. I'm just saying often when I've seen these claims, because I've been asked, you write a chapter and somebody says, write a section of the chapter on like specificity for different kinds of drugs. And I've never seen anything, you'll find studies that find it, but I've not been aware of, I don't know, Tim, if you've, whenever I've been asked to look, I've looked. Wendy, I don't know if there's anything that pops up in your head. Yeah. No, and she'll have things too, is like, and that interacts even with gender. So anxiety sensitivity and alcohol in women. But, there may be some things like boredom susceptibility might be a little bit more in cigarette smokers, but often I find it's more whatever favorite trait people have.
I was thinking more sociological differences in personality.
Okay. Any other comments? Or? Well, if not, thanks everybody.